Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Industry 4.0 Club's Fireside. The club's purpose is to engage the power of a diverse worldwide talent in the global evolution to the deployment of Industry 4.0. We accomplish this by hosting respectful, diverse, and thoughtful interdisciplinary open conversations about Industry 4.0 and other relevant topics to expand the reach of our community. My name is Mike Ungar, and I'm one of the Industry 4.0 co-founders. My background is I spent 35 years at Michelin North America, and today I'm a business coach and executive coach. Hosting along with me today will be Mike Yost. Mike, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thank you, Mike. As Mike said, my name is Mike Yost. I'm one of the co-founders of Industry 4.0 Club. I've been in industrial automation, industrial software, and what we would call Industry 4.0 for a little over 30 years myself. And I have had the good fortune of working with Mr. McClellan for probably almost half of that time. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Michael and having the conversations here today.
Thanks, Mike. So our guest today is Michael McClellan. Mike's the principal at Collaboration Synergies Inc. And his background, he's got many years of experience in manufacturing management and manufacturing enterprise executive leadership. Michael is a leading voice for manufacturing system software tools for the production environment and specifically for information management. He's a prolific author and has recently begun a series of writing on production process management as an enterprise level approach to managing MES and other production activities across plants and supply chain. Michael, we're really glad that you could join us today. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So let's just jump right in. Just before we do, I want to mention those of you that are on LinkedIn Live who would be following us, if you have a question or comment for Michael during our conversation today, please put it in the comment box and we'll be glad to get it to Michael and answer it during the time we have together. So we're going to explore the importance of information flow and how best to manage the different aspects within our factory. So Michael, I know you've been supporting manufacturing and information systems for well over 3 decades. Can you talk for a little bit of how you've seen things evolve since you started doing this work way back when?
Well, it certainly have evolved. There's no question about that. I spent my entire life either managing manufacturing entities or serving them, one or the other. Mostly from a physical sense. I personally spent a lot of time on the plant floor. And one of the early endeavors I've had goes back to the 80s where we developed something that we now call MES, which is just a way of gathering data on the plant floor. That's evolved to something quite different than what it was meant to be originally or what it seemed to be. That's probably the biggest change, is just the evolution of the use of and the generation of information on the plant floor.
I'm sure at some point, Michael, we'll get into things that haven't changed as well, right? I'm sure there are many things with understanding mindset and the way operations run. Because one of the things I think is important, as you mentioned in your background, you also have experience running and being an executive business leader in the manufacturing side as well, right?
That is correct, and I think that one of the things that I see lacking sometimes when we look at information on the plant floor is the breadth of perspective that one should take. I try to look at it from a plant manager's viewpoint. What do I need to run the business? It's not what I mean by the latest application, but what do I really need to run the business? And when you look at it that way, I think you end up where you start with a broader perspective of what's going on. And the anomalies that may come along to change that perspective on a minute-by-minute basis. So I think perspective is a large part of just the beginning to look at what plant information is all about.
In my experience, one of the things that was a big challenge, going back to your point about perspective, is when way too often I've seen where people gather data but they don't use it. they think they need it, but then they don't take advantage of it to drive progress or to make change. How do you sort through that? How do you deal with the fact that maybe you start tracking something or collecting data and find you don't need it? Did you see that happen to yourself as well?
Well, that has been an ongoing problem since I've been involved with this business. I remember one time within the plant information business, there was a strong argument that it did not require a return on investment. You just should do it. I found it then, and I find that to be a false idea. I don't know of any reason to do something without a financial perspective if you're in a business. So you, I think, have to bring that down to, why do I collect an item of data? What am I going to do with it? And what's the return on investment I can get from it? So again, I think that if you look at it from a software developer perspective, that you say, well, Mr. Customer, you need this for your plant. I have a hard time dealing with that, because if I'm in my own business, and whether I'm the owner or the plant floor worker, it's me that understands what I need, or should. If I don't, I'm really in the wrong place. But what we have had is many vendor generated ideas put forth to manufacturing, with the idea that the manufacturer could just change and do whatever the vendor suggested, which I think is also a very bad idea. So it's just how you use data, and how you, from where you start. It isn't from how you, it's from where you begin, what you think is important, and how you value that, I think.
Well, and Michael, from in full disclosure, Michael and I have known each other for a long time, and I'm a huge fan of his perspective. And we titled this episode here today that production processes are business processes. So maybe Michael, talk a bit about the process focus, even what you just talked about a minute ago, the fact that you look at things from a plant manager's perspective, versus an application perspective, or like you just talked about, from a software developer's perspective. So talk about the importance of that, and really what you mean by that, and then tie it in with the concept of the information flow. Because I think, to Mike's point, as networking has become easier, as communications have become easier, as we have more sensors and all that stuff, the idea of just capturing, collecting, storing data has run rampant, right? Collect everything. You just made the point that collect things that have a business value. So talk about how your view from a process perspective provides clarity around that information flow.
Well, to start with, I think that we should recognize what we have in the sense of information. A typical plant has anywhere from 50 to 100 information resources on the plant floor in each plant. So if you have a multi-plant company, you really get to hundreds of application resources. And if you consider the value chain, the entire value chain of the enterprise, which I think is part of this process, you have even more. So I think when you look at applications and data, or just data elements in general, that's, I believe, the wrong perspective. I'm suggesting changing, and have now for a number of years, changing the perspective to a product-driven perspective. And that is, if I'm making this product in this plant, what information do I need to do it most effectively? To me, that's the starting point. Secondarily is, where is that information and how do I apply it now to my process at this point in time? So that is a significantly different approach than looking at how many applications or how many sensors I've got that can deliver data.
Yeah, certainly agree with that. I like to talk all the time about my ring here and how it provides data for me, and it's a good example of Industry 4.0. I have all the data that I would ever want, but I don't really use it. I haven't established the business model or the business value, other than it's really cool, and my wife bought it for me, and it isn't connected to a higher level, purpose like you're talking about from the plant manager's perspective. So maybe for the folks that are watching here, because we could have people that are in all different areas, right? Like from a plant manager's perspective, more likely it's folks that are trying to provide solutions, and maybe in an engineering capacity or even a software vendor's perspective. Do you have any advice for people of how to change how they look at things and how they talk the talk of a plant manager, or suggestions of going to sit in different kinds of meetings than they historically have? How do you make this this connection to people internally in a business about looking at it from sort of the product driven perspective versus the systems level perspective?
Well, I think the people in the plant, no matter what their level is, are already focused on the process of making things. We have some number of products we make in a plant. We have a certain number of steps that we go through to make that. We have certain information that we require. People know that. The people on the production line certainly know that, and the people in management know this. So if we're going to, let's say, make a batch of Campbell's soup, people know step one, step two, what's going on to make that product come out the way it is expected to be. That's the focal point. But we get away from that with the idea that, well, what we need to make our soup correctly is a lot of data. I kind of disagree with that idea. I think we need supportive information to make our soup the correct way. But a lot of data is not necessarily a requirement. We start with the idea that we're going to make a product. We know the steps that comes automatically. Every product in every manufacturing facility that I know of begins with something of a design, and maybe the back of an envelope. But in that design, there is a suggested steps of manufacturing. I punch a hole first. I weld this bracket on next. I weld the next bracket on after that. We understand that. The questions that I think should be there are, how do we support that more effectively? And it is that perspective across the business. And I think the person on the plant floor has as much to do with that as the executive in the top floor. I had a conversation a couple of days ago with someone from Toyota, and they are encouraging and training their plant floor people to develop and support processes specific to their workstation, which I think is a fantastic idea. That's called citizen development, by the way. That's the term that's used for that. But it is the process, I think, that is the focal point, rather than an information sweep or other concepts of, let's drag all this data off the plant floor, sift through it, and see what we can use. I go the other way around, say this is what we need to do what we have to do. And everybody know, I should say everybody, I don't mean it that way, but people know what has to be done to make their products and get their job done at every workstation. And that goes to the manufacturing engineer, it goes to the plant manager, it goes to the ERP system. Those things are well understood. There's no mystery there that I know of.
That makes a lot of sense. I think I was listening to you talk about that, and I think about the idea of asking the worker who's on the front line, what information do you need in order to do your job better, and then providing them with that data. And I think what's interesting about what's evolved today is we can do a much better job now of giving them that information in real time. Whereas in the past, it was, it almost didn't make sense to provide it because it was so far removed from when it happened that it didn't add any value. Can you talk about that for a moment, about how what you see, this evolution in real-time data, how you've seen that impact different businesses?
Well, I think there's no question we're moving closer to something that they're calling a digital enterprise, which is really all focused on providing contexted information that is accurate and timely and specific to its point of use. The problem at the moment is we have been driven to have these 60 plus applications, and across each plant. Now the question is, how do we get data out of them? How do we put it together in the proper context for the end user? Again, I think that's the wrong way to go about it. I'd rather start at the beginning and say, what data do we really need? And then identify how we can support that requirement. I think it's just a different perspective that I believe companies ought to take. I've been referring to that as production process management, which identifies the steps to make anything. Again, just looking at typical industrial engineering. Step one requires certain information. It's at a certain location. It can be brought to this location. It can be put in a context that's accurate. And then step two, and then step three. There's nothing complicated about making products when you think along that line. I've done a lot of work with Boeing over the years, and even a 787 has a beginning step and an end step. Now, there's a whole bunch of things go on in between those, but each of those steps that you make, including putting the door hinge on a 787, is broken down into a number of tasks that are required. So how do you support those tasks specifically to each instance of use? And you can't always get there, but I think that's the place to start. And then in a company like Boeing, where you're making aircraft that are have to be made in a certain way, they focus on that information as it comes from engineering. The plant has to have that same focus and be in sync with that. And I think you can spread that idea across whether you're making semiconductors, whether you're making Campbell's soup, or whether you're making gasoline. There are certain steps and certain things you have to do to support that process. And again, that's the production process, as I call it.
Yeah, maybe stick with that for just a second, Michael. For everybody's reference, Michael's been advocating and writing on this topic of PPM. He's authored several books going back many years prior to PPM as well. But where would somebody go, Michael, to get information if they like this concept that you're discussing about a process-centric view of manufacturing the products that you make? Your website, how would people find out more information about what you've authored? Because there's a ton of information that Michael has prepared that I think is consumable and people would find value in.
Well, I've certainly got a lot of stuff that's written. It's posted on manufacturingbpm.com. I'm always available to take calls and chat with anybody about anything on this subject. So feel free to call me if you'd like. On the website is my contact information. But there's a number of papers. I shouldn't say a lot of information, but it is a lot of information. But there are some specific papers relating to plant floor operations that talk about the process concept rather than a data-centric or an application-centric perspective. So yeah, I'd encourage anyone to check there. You can Google some of this information and our website will pop up because when it comes to collaborative and production process management, it is a good source for general information. And again, I'd be happy to chat with anybody who wants to talk about it.
When you talked about the process of determining what data you want to capture, I couldn't help but think what you described would be relatively easy to do in a greenfield environment, but relatively hard to do in a brownfield environment where you already have lots of legacy things that you're doing. Talk about the difference between those two types of situations. I mean, how does one sort through in a brownfield, getting rid of the stuff that no longer makes sense and starting the stuff that does make sense?
Well, that's always an interesting question, and it's one that bedevils the software industry everywhere you go, and manufacturing in particular. I'm not sure even how to answer that, because when you look at a typical plant, I worked on a project with Intel a few years ago in a small plant, 300 employees. It was very specific task that they did with Intel, and it took us 2 weeks to identify the software applications in use on the platform. 2 weeks in a 300-person plant, and we found this by conversation. It was no place written down, but we ended up with some I don't recall, maybe 30 different applications on the plant floor. And those were the purchased applications. Those were not the spreadsheets that individuals were using on the side. So you look at all this information, and if you look at it from that angle, all you see is a lot of forms, a lot of people putting in information, but it's hard to get back to the production step. So I think that the difference between a greenfield and an older plant where the legacy applications exist is one of perspective. If you look at what we're making on this day in this plant, what information do I need? And by the way, that's going to be different. Plants are just different from one to another, even within the same company, with the exception of Intel. All plants are identical for a purpose. But the point is, when you look at the processes of producing a specific plant or a specific product, and you look at the steps, you can identify data usage and where that exists in the current data lake, which is the new buzzword for all the legacy systems. We're calling that the data lake these days. So I think if you identify the specific data element that you need, and then you search for where that is in your enterprise, as the easiest to retrieve, best utilization, that's the way you treat legacy systems. You're never going to get rid of, I think, the legacy systems because they've been there for years. People are used to using them, whether they use them or not. I'm always, when people talk about legacy systems, I digress here for a moment, but there's a story that during the Second World War, there was an island that had 16 sailors on it, and they had to report into Washington, D.C. Once a week, and on whatever they were reporting on, which they all thought was useless. So the sailors decided they would send in the fly report. They would count the flies they had seen that week and report that to Washington, D.C. Well, they got used to that, did that for weeks and weeks. Every week they'd send in the fly report. Then one day they decided this is kind of boring, so we won't send the fly report in anymore. Of course, immediately they got a request from Washington, where is the fly report? And I think that concept of this data that exists there, it's duplicated, quadruplicated in many times, but it's like the fly report. Many times it's a crutch that's not necessarily specific to what we're trying to accomplish. And I apologize for my anecdote regarding the fly report, but I've always found that kind of interesting connection.
Well, I like the fly report analogy. So I guess we could back up just a step here. You talked about two things earlier, one being like citizen developers, and that's certainly something that we're seeing a focus on nowadays. And I know over the course of my career, that was something that as a software vendor, we worked to fight against, right? We wanted people buying our solutions, our platforms, and our partners delivering and supporting and building out the capabilities. You see the need, I think, nowadays, and I think the excitement around the evolving technologies. It says, hey, now this is possible because we have low-cost sensors and we have cloud and edge and all sorts of advances in technology that makes this development a lot easier. So I think it's there's an enabler there that's getting people more and more excited to go out and build applications. There's danger in that, as we've lived through for the last several decades, and that you end up with all of these disparate systems and these islands that don't talk to each other and such. And so that brings in sort of the need to tie in with some corporate structure, some corporate governance, the IT world. And so that bridge between the plant from a solutions perspective, your vantage point, Michael, on sort of bridging that gap organizationally, because even the name of your website that you mentioned was Manufacturing BPM, right? And BPM is business process management is a defined domain or software solution set, typically more relevant or more well understood at the enterprise side than it is at the plant side. At the plant side, it's probably more workflow. People are familiar with workflow engines and such. So maybe talk a little bit about how you're talking about or living through that those two different worlds, still working, trying to bring the two worlds together, and how your viewpoint either helps that, or what friction that you see existing in that, I guess, bridging that gap between the plant folks and the enterprise folks.
Well, first of all, I think it's one of understanding and grasping what we have. And when I say that, when you look at, as I see it, there are three categories of information management within the typical manufacturing enterprise. There's the ERP system, which has all your administrative functions. Everything is tied together. Everyone knows how to write a check, pay a bill, order something. You have another category of product data, which is usually called PLM or something close to that, which is an assortment of functions specific to the product itself. All easily accessible, typically well integrated, well oiled, and fairly obvious to most people. Then there's the other category of information. I won't say software applications, but information generally in what I call supply chain management category, which includes the MES, the maintenance, the logistics, the packaging, all the information that goes into making the product. And if you divide them up that way, then you think, all right, how do I link those together? Because it is a fact that when you're going to make a product, all those categories of information come into play. The problem at the moment is the third category of supply chain is a scattered assemblage depending on each plant and what's there. So what I've suggested is to view manufacturing from a process by product perspective, or a product driven perspective. Again, to think about in step one of making the product, what information do I need? Where is its best source, and how do I get it visible to the user? It's, I think, as simple as that, and it's the process. And that's why I'm calling that production process management. Now, you mentioned BPM, business process management. I don't hate to get into all these buzzwords, but process management based on originations of ideas of workflow, step one, step two, step three, sequential events going on. Developed in the 90s. Software was developed in the late 90s to mechanize the idea of that process and support that from a basic and fundamental technology view. Today, that's in common use in everywhere in business except manufacturing. And I'm arguing for manufacturing to use that. Now, the ERP systems use this. The PLM systems even use business process. But the issue has been looking at it from a process perspective and then using business process tools to establish the information transmission, retrieval, dissemination, formatting, in whatever way we can do it. We can easily, and I say this very easily, to say that it's easy to model a process of your manufacturing events, easy to identify where that data resides. And with today's APIs and other integration tools, it's easy to simply reach out, grab that data, and bring it to a way that is visibly or otherwise useful. That's what's in part what's driving the plant floor citizen development activity. The tools are there to retrieve data and put it in your context that you need for your point of views. That's what's easier today than it's ever been. Viewing it as a process is what has to be done now. And I think the local citizen at a machine or a workstation knows what information they need. And now we're giving them tools to be able to do that. I'm a little concerned about the chaos that might be, because of now if I have in a good sized company, hundreds, if not thousands of these mini processes running. Again, we get to kind of a third layer of data resource that is not visible to the enterprise, but is kind of hidden under everybody's desk, like an Excel spreadsheet is today.
Right.
Along with that,
Go ahead.
in the end on that, I think you mentioned BPM, and it's interesting to me that business process management, which is a fundamental building block everywhere except in manufacturing, is an easy to use tool to assemble information. And I recommend that people look at BPM, business process management, as a business advantage. It's in use around the world. It's one of the fastest growing, has been for the last 25 years, one of the fastest growing categories of software development. In the US, I think the market for BPM tools is in the vicinity of $30 billion, which is in excess of what we spend in manufacturing on software. So just something to think about. Business process management as a science is here, and it's not going anyplace. It's a very rapidly growing part of every business.
And Mike, I know you have a question. Just one little anecdote there. Going back probably at least a decade, Michael brought a BPM provider into the Mesa organization, and there was great excitement about the collaboration there with them and plant floor solution providers and such. And it was a really difficult. It was really difficult to get them to really come into the manufacturing space, and for the others that were traditionally plant floor centric to know how to work together. It was a very unnatural kind of thing that I think just supports what Michael said about the fact that this stuff's being used in all industries, but we haven't seen it widely adopted and used in manufacturing. So,
and I find that kind of unusual, aside from the fact that the industry of developing software for plants is largely built around what vendors bring to the party rather than what the customer needs or wants. So you have very large, very competent companies such as Dassault and PTC and Siemens and others who have a vast array of answers that they're willing to bring to manufacturing. Unfortunately, manufacturing has relied on those vendors rather than taking a stronger stand of their own. So we end up, in many cases, software has been purchased for a manufacturing entity with the idea that we will change our factory to operate according to the software, which is a bizarre concept as far as I'm concerned. We want software that supports how we run our business. We're not going to change our business to see how Siemens wants to define their software. I think that's step one. Step two, it's a journey. These are never events. This is a continuous and evolving journey. We're now at these new terms of digital manufacturing, manufacturing 4.0, smart manufacturing, all of which are aimed towards the processes of improving manufacturing on an evolutionary basis. We're going to continue doing this for a number of years. My job is fairly safe. There's always an opportunity to provide information in this space and grow.
I heard you speak about, thank you, Michael. I heard you think about those three different sort of system or elements, the ERP, which is the admin that you talked about, product data, as well as the information, then the supply chain MES. Most manufacturers today are trying to link all those together. At least that's my understanding. Am I on base in thinking that way? Is that what you want to do in a factory?
Well, they are. I think they are trying to link them together, but I'm not sure I fully understand the purpose of that. Linking them together, having your MES talk to your ERP system is certainly a great thing. But then you got to say, why do I do this, and is this the best way? What I would argue is to link them together based on what each product requires. Looking at your products that you're making, what is required. If you're a company, and this gets a little difficult, but if you're a company such as Mondelez, let's say making Oreo cookies, which I think has, I'm going to pick a number here, I'm not sure what the firm number is, but there are something like 60 plus versions or SKUs for Oreo cookies. That involves...
Notwithstanding the milk that you need for yourself. Yeah.
Yes, that's true. That wasn't in the recipe for the cookies. That's something that's come secondary.
Exactly.
So when you're thinking about information for all 60 plus of those SKUs, and keep in mind, Mondelez has 100,000 plus products that they make across the world. So if you're going to try to put that into, well, how much do I put in the MES? How much do I put in the scheduling? What do I do here and what do I do there for each of this? It never gets done. It never gets done. We end up doing this piecemeal on a plant by plant basis, and just the typical changes in the plant. After 2 years, you look backwards and there's nothing the same anymore. So when you're thinking integration with this data ahead of time, I think it just becomes a big, and we have not accomplished it. No matter where you go. Again, I would like to look at it from this instance of this product being made in this plant. What does that require? Well, it requires information from this ERP system at this point in time. It requires information from the PLM system at this point in time. It requires information from the oven setting SCADA system at this point in time. So I know that what that is. I already know that information. I'm suggesting we build this information model and use business process management tools to retrieve the information and download it to these workstations and provide the orchestration of the workflow information specific to its point of use. I just said a whole lot there. When I say that fast, it sounds easy. Actually, it really is easy. It's easy when you think about, and this is what they do in the factory, when you think about step one, I'm going to release a production order to make a 6-pack Oreo cookie with white frosting, and it's going to be 3 layers. There are certain information elements that reside in a number of places in the enterprise. Now at step one, I need certain information. I need a recipe. I need to know that the inventory is available. I need to have a scale to weigh my recipe amounts on, and I'm going to put that in the mixer. I need information to know how long to run the mixer and at what speed for this particular recipe in this particular plant. We can build a model of that and support that model and run it, which executes that recipe and moves the information according to the point of need. I think that's a much easier way to look at it rather than sitting in an IT silo someplace trying to determine ahead of time what's required.
I want to just take what you said, and we didn't talk about this in advance, so I hope I don't catch you off guard with this question. One of the things that I am a proponent of is lean manufacturing. And one of the things I think is foundational with lean is a value stream map. And if you're familiar with that approach, the value stream map really has 2 key pieces of information. It has the process flow and has information flow on it. Have you used a value stream map yourself? And how, if you have, how has it helped you in addressing what you just described, really, which is piecing together the value add and the information and process, complexity together?
I have to admit that value stream mapping is something I have not done. I've looked at it briefly, and it's on my list of things to do. I have a friend of mine who's a lean expert, and he's pushing me in that direction. So that's I'll write that down as my next agenda item, is to get more into the value mapping. I'm aware of the concept, but not of the details. But my guess is it can't be too far different from what I just described.
Yeah, well, that's what made me think of it. It helps you create a picture of exactly what you just talked about, and challenges you to get rid of the stuff that's not value add. In that process.
Well, and I think that's kind of my weak point. When I think of lean, I think of the process of eliminating what you don't need, rather than focusing on what you do. And I think I've been hung up with that gap, and really recognizing how to use lean more effectively. I apologize for that. It's a lacking on my part.
I appreciate your transparency there. It seems to me that a value stream map would be a very valuable tool. Well, I'm starting to know it is, when done correctly, to help you also define what exactly you need to serve the client, serve the customer, both in terms of the process and in terms of information. Mm-hmm. So it can be very helpful then, as well as we talk about both mapping, going back to brownfield, the current situation, and then also mapping the future state, where you want to go to ensure you get rid of the stuff, maybe add what you need. So it's really can be quite a very valuable tool to visualize the things we've been talking about.
I think you're very right. I promise to take a deep dive in that and come up a little better prepared next time.
I apologize for catching off guard there. So
well, it's not. It's always kind of odd that lean has always been a step away from manufacturing. the lean guy usually is not a factory person. He's a somewhere else person, or she, which I always found kind of interesting, that it's not as specific as the industrial engineer who's working on the plant floor. But your point's well made. I think I'm going to reach out to my library and see where I can bring it up to speed, because it's just any of these methods, I think, that identify the specific, and I say specific, that's, to me, that's the issue. This operation in this plant on this shift this day, what do I need to do that most effectively? Now, there are tools today to make that very even personal perspective. For example, with a production process management tool, I can be specific even in the language of which I'm delivering work instructions to a worker at a workstation. If a man from Japan happens to be the operator, I can deliver work instructions in Japanese just as easy as I can deliver them in English, as long as I build that in my requirements of doing it. So when you're focusing on the specific information to get the job done, any of this layout information, any of this planning information, any way to make that more visible, I think is a big help.
Yeah, it just what keeps going through my head is what's happened over my career. What's happening a lot nowadays is just this abundance of data, right? We're in the data is the new oil. Data is the table stakes for everything we do, and we have just, if we look at the pyramid of capturing data and moving up to insights and knowledge and information, et cetera, like exponentially blowing out the amount of data that's available for us. And if everybody gets enamored with capturing that and the easiness of capturing that and having access to it without a perspective of the process flow and the information flow, that you lose sight of real business value. And so I think that's a critical point to the point you guys were both just making.
I think it is information rather than data, right. And focused information. We used to use the word context a lot. You can get data and you can then add context, or whether it is or isn't. So I think information specific to the task at hand is what we're required. Some people at Dow Chemical made an interesting observation for me. Dow Chemical has, in round numbers, 100,000 products. 100,000 products that they make in approximately 120 plants around the world. And this individual was telling me about 10% of those products change every year. So that's 10,000 changes or product changes that have to be broadcast to a very specific plant, very specific operation, a very specific worker. This is no longer in the cloud. When you say, I've got to change the wrapper, the glue container is in Pakistan now has to say this word instead of that word on it. That is a very specific thing that is required. And excuse me, one of the issues that we're being talked about is, excuse me, the length of time it takes to make those changes across a company like Dow Chemical. So that's the way to think about this, I think, and not all the information you can get from those 100 plants. I mean, just think about that. If you have a data sweep 17 times a day from 100 plants around the world, it seems to me you just have a large database. It's like scooping sand off the beach. You're looking for that lost wedding ring, but you have to search the whole beach to do it. Well, maybe it's worthwhile, and maybe it isn't. I'd rather be very specific in what information I need and how I can use it in the right way. And again, I go back to this Dow Chemical example. And these are the kinds of issues that need to be addressed. It's this entity-wide, value chain-wide issue that I just mentioned. I'm making glue, and it's going to be shipped into Pakistan. It's going to be made in Jakarta, Indonesia, going to Pakistan, and it has to meet certain criteria along the way. That's not just a making it. That's a whole business process that has a set of steps that have to be connected, combined, and have to be accurate. Otherwise, you have product recalls, and we go down that bad hill. So when you look at it from that perspective, I think information becomes a whole lot more information, and it's end-to-end information. It's not, you can't stop in the middle someplace. I often talk about packaging and packaging material, and if you're looking at MES, there's very few MES systems that focus on packaging material. They don't go there with that. That's too much of a detail. So, in my perspective, when you're looking at information, you have to look at the end-to-end information requirements and dovetail those via a process, because it's a company set of activities that produce that product. And the CEO doesn't have a hand in that on a daily basis, but occasionally he or she does have a hand in that, and that has to show up someplace in that end product being delivered in Pakistan. I use those examples just making them up, but that's what a global entity has to do.
Well, Mike, I know we're getting short on time here. One other thing just goes through my mind real quickly. Talking about companies like Dow and Mondelez and such, like large corporations. You mentioned a small plant in one of the companies having 300 employees. A lot of the folks in the club that pay attention to what we're doing here come from smaller organizations. So is there a size of organization where what you're talking about makes sense? Is this something simply for a large organization like Dow, or is this something you think that scales down to the mid-market or to the smaller organizations? What are your thoughts on size?
Well, I only use the Dow and Boeing examples because they're easy and they're cute to talk about, and they make this sound even more important than it really is.
Yeah.
But it really isn't. Actually, the real core opportunity, I think, is in the small to medium-sized companies, where we are looking for tools to support them more effectively. They're part of a value chain in most cases, not always, but almost all cases. Small to medium-sized companies are part of a bigger company's activity. But it is those small to medium-sized companies that don't have the benefit that a Dow has, where they have dozens of people doing IT stuff. So I think the newer focus is looking at those processes. Again, those processes in a 50-person company or a 100-person company. What information specifically do they need? How do we maintain that on a real-time basis? I did work with a client a couple of years ago in Mexico who had an interesting environment. They had a building, and within that building, they had a number of 10-person manufacturing companies, believe it or not, making automobile parts. And this client wanted to know how we could use production process concepts with that environment, because the automotive companies were subcontracting or contracting out to these 10-person companies in one plant. And there was 10 of them in one plant. 10-person companies in this plant were making automotive products such as wiring harness or things like that for the automotive companies in Mexico. So that's the environment I think that needs a lot of support, if you will, and some newer ideas, and I think can benefit from process perspective. Just looking at what do I really need, where can I get it, and how can I tie that into this opportunity most effectively. And I believe that's out there today. The technology is not expensive. It can be run in the cloud. You don't even have to have your computer on your plant floor. It can be someplace else. So I know of many instances where processes are being run on an amount of cost, or I can buy a process to be executed for 50 cents an instance, for example. Now, there are ways to do that, and I think that'll be very supportive of the smaller manufacturer, where they don't have to invest in large IT infrastructure. They can do it all on an online basis with their telephone terminal, or something equally useful from an electronic perspective.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. The small to mid-sized guys, we find they're the ones that need to get going. The big guys that you mentioned have the resources and have already thought about a lot of these things. I think the small and mid-sized guys, they need to get working on this to improve their competitiveness. And that's really one of the things we certainly encourage them. Well, as we're getting close to the end of this time together, it's been great listening to your your perspective and hearing your insights. Michael, before we wrap up, Mike, I'll maybe give you a chance to give us the last thought, then I'll pass it to Michael for a last thought.
Yeah, I did. Well, I'm sorry, Michael. Just quickly, I mean, I think the points, my main takeaway from the conversation with Michael is about this different way of looking at the information flow driven by the product that you're trying to make. I think it makes sense. It's how things are done in practice. It's not how the systems are typically built. And so it's really a perspective to turn things upside down and simplify things. So I think what Michael's offering is a way to potentially simplify things for us in a really complicated or getting more complicated space that we're in, that's technology driven and data driven and all that such. So to look at things for how you actually make the products that you're making, and have tools like you two were discussing and systems to come alongside and simplify, I think is probably the biggest takeaway that I have from the conversation.
Well, I think that where it's going, the idea of digitization, which is not easy to say by anybody, but it's another one of those. It's like talking about the cloud. I remember when the cloud was first coming along. What a term! I mean, yeah, I see the idea and I know kind of where it originated, but it gives me nothing of value. It seems puffy and fluffy, and it doesn't seem real to me. But I think when you think about information in these small to medium-sized enterprises, particularly as they fit in a value chain someplace, they are almost all part of a bigger world. And it is, I think, viewing certain aspects of that world on their own terms. If you're an automotive vendor, and if you're making wheels, or if you're making something that would seem simple, like a door handle, from General Motors' perspective, you're making that door handle is not a simple process. It's integral. Somewhere there's a car that needs that specific door handle you're working on at this moment. That's the tie, I think. And I think the ability to convey an inclusive information environment that supports not only GM at the assembly plant site, but also the incoming material received at that stamping plant that's going to make that door handle, or that chrome plating plant that's plating it. Part of that has to be an inclusionary envelope that has information available at very, very low cost and ease of use.
Well, thank you, Michael, for that. So I want to just take a moment and thank Mike and Michael for taking the time to away from their schedules to join us for this really interesting discussion about data and information and really overall, I guess, business process management. And thank you also to everybody who's joined us on LinkedIn Live, Twitter, and YouTube. If you like conversations like this, the Industry 4.0 Club, we host them every week around topics related to women in manufacturing, the future of manufacturing, fireside chat like this one, and people, process, and culture. The club has also begun to publish a newsletter. And if you'd like to sign up for that newsletter or access other valuable information from the club, please go to our website at www.industry4oclub.com. And please also just join us on our LinkedIn page. We have quite a few folks that stay in touch with what we're doing there as well. I hope everybody has a good rest of the day and a great week. And Michael, again, thank you so much for your time, and Mike as well.
Thank you for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael.
All right. Bye, everybody. Have a great week.